21st century Sunwebs, who stands for Hong Kong protests. And what is waiting for Xi Jinping? In Hong Kong, protests do not cease, and they take place, in the literal sense, with a twinkle. The protesters not only beat the windows of shops and offices, but also threw bottles at the police station with Molotov cocktails. The guards answered with tear gas and water jets. What is happening in the special administrative region of China? Who and what is behind the riots? And what will be the outcome of the Hong Kong riot? The famous Orientalist, the head of the analytical center of the Izborsk Club Russian Dream and Chinese Dream Yuri Tavrovsky talked about this with MK. Sacred sacrifice. For 4 months, protests in Hong Kong have not stopped. Who gets tired of this before? To the protesting public, and then all this protest will be blown away. Or Beijing, and then tough measures will be taken. I think that the X hour is approaching, when this bumbling can either be curtailed, a decisive action will be taken by the Hong Kong government. It is Hong Kong, not China. Hong Kong. The solution to the problem of protests is the prerogative of the Hong Kong authorities. And the fact that China does not intervene is a manifestation of its solidity, fidelity to this word. And the word was given by Deng Xiaoping Margaret Thatcher, after Hong Kong comes under Chinese sovereignty in 1997, for 50 years there will be preserved the existing way of life, existing laws, existing money. In a word, everything that is characteristic of an independent state, with the exception of defense and foreign policy, Hong Kong does not have the right to open embassies and does not have the right to maintain its armed forces. He has the right to everything else. All this is called the policy of one country, two systems. A few months ago, I entered Hong Kong from mainland China. Hong Kong border guards issued me a visa. I changed money and received Hong Kong dollars. I drove in right-hand transport. He visited the editorial board of the very popular South China Morning Post newspaper in Hong Kong and beyond, and the colleagues working there told me that they did not have restrictions on freedom of the press. But back to the exile. When should everything happen? I don't know what day it will be exactly. But I think that it will be in October. Because in October of this year, a plenary meeting of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party is due to take place. The plenum is held once a year, in its significance it approaches the Congress. And at the next plenary session, certainly, the situation in Hong Kong will be discussed by the top Chinese leadership. Most experts were sure that the escalation of protests, and this is precisely about escalation, because when it all started, the abuse took place on Sundays, now every day, and tougher, will reach its peak by October 1, when 70th anniversary of the Indeed, on that day in Hong Kong for the first time the police used live ammunition, and an 18-year-old high school student who was shot in the shoulder was injured. I thought and still think that the appearance of a sacred sacrifice will be the peak. Someone must be killed, blood must be shed before the plenum with a fatal outcome. To raise the body in your arms and carry it along the streets and avenues of Hong Kong. A sacred sacrifice is an indispensable apotheosis of any color revolution. I think that if nothing happens on the eve of the Beijing plenum, then gradually everything will begin to calm down, because it will become clear that this has not hurt the Chinese. In general, we overestimate the importance of events in Hong Kong for China. We live in television pictures and correspondent messages. In China, thousands of demonstrations take place every year, and rest happens. For example, peasants from whom developers take away land for development. Actions are being taken against incinerators, against landfills, against smoke, against corruption of officials, against counterfeit products and drugs. But this is happening inside China. The Chinese media rather sparingly cover these events, the information goes into the blogosphere. And in Hong Kong, a very beautiful picture. But this picture does not give the whole, and on the website of the same newspaper South China Morning Post, videos are constantly laid up. And what goes on there is just horror. Because it is not the police who beat the demonstrators and are cruel. And the guys, who are attacking one policeman with all six and start to beat with iron bars. The good boys are poured with fuel, they all go with the Molotov cocktail, the policeman, and set fire to it. And this man runs in his flaming armor, very picturesque pictures. I think that we attach too much importance to the events in Hong Kong. These disturbances must be looked at in the context of the Chinese rebel tradition. The Chinese are very easy to rise, quickly excited, rebel, staging demonstrations and revolutions. For example, in May 1919, students in the Beijing Tiananmen Square held a Massachusetts demonstration against the Treaty of Versailles following the results of the World War, which seemed unfair to them. Some participants in this demonstration became the founders of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. Student demonstrations continued against the Japanese aggressors, against their generals. Let's remember the Mao Zedong said, riot is a just cause. Plan B. Well, yes, the Hunweibens and Jafani showed themselves then. And what is the difference between Hunweibens and the guys who are now losing their way on the streets of Hong Kong? Unless the fact that they have more modern gadgets. Notification is conducted over the internet. And before Days Bay was hung, everyone gathered there and then. I myself saw with my own eyes the same youth uprising in 1989 on Tiananmen Square. Then the demonstrations were not only in Beijing, but throughout China. In a word, this tradition lives on. And very many thought that following Hong Kong, neighboring Guangzhou would rise, Shanghai, Beijing would rise. Indeed, leaflets were posted in some places. But it was also microscopic, and only at the beginning. Now the general opinion of young people in China, the informal opinion that is expressed in the blogosphere, is the indignation of Hong Kong protesters. And even hatred for them. Against this background, a surge of patriotism is visible. I do not know if Xi Jinping is right or not when he does not take harsh measures. Formally, he does not have the right to take these very measures. Because until they say in Hong Kong that they want to secede from China, some already talk about this, but with a tongue twister, until they create some other threat to the territorial integrity of the country, I think it will not bring pursuant to Plan B. And Plan B certainly exists. All TV channels showed how armed police units and special equipment were being transferred to Shenzhen, neighboring Hong Kong. Now everything is being done to push Xi Jinping to Plan B. Why does he not accept this Plan B? Not only because he is a Junji, a Confucian gentleman. Word was given that Hong Kong would not be touched for 50 years. So he does not touch. Moreover, the great Deng Xiaoping himself gave the floor. This is one possible interpretation. But I think there are even more important reasons. The first reason is that Hong Kong is very important for the Chinese economic miracle, for the Chinese dream as the largest financial center through which huge operations are carried out, and not always in white. These operations are carried out both by the state, through the Bank of China operating in Hong Kong, and by Chinese enterprises and state-owned companies. Stocks are sold there, colossal deals go through. This year, in the midst of the US-China trade war, up to $1.6 billion a day went from China through Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, banks are stored giant deposits of people from the mainland. At the same time, a similar financial infrastructure has been created nearby in Shenzhen, where a special economic zone operates. There is an exchange banks. Do you know what is not? No English law. In Hong Kong, however, English law, which applies to transactions, and finance, and anything else. It is because of this principle that everything began there. Is not it? Absolutely right. The head of the local government, Catherine Lam, introduced a bill to abolish the Cossack rule. Then the people took to the streets. But there is a second reason. In addition to the Hong Kong problem, Beijing faces the Taiwan problem, which is much more important than the restoration of territorial integrity. After all, the Chinese believe that for them the Second World War did not end, they are still a divided nation. All my acquaintances, Chinese analysts and experts, are sure that the Taiwan problem will be solved during the presidency of Xi Jinping. This is his dream, his duty. He secretly competes with Deng Xiaoping. He has another economic program, socialism with the Chinese characteristics of a new era. Contrary to the advice of the reform architect, he does not want to remain in the shadows, save up strength and wait for an opportunity. No, he pursues an active foreign policy. And if Deng Xiaoping returned Hong Kong and Macau to China, what should Xi Jinping return? Taiwan. There are two ways, good and bad. The Chinese still hope to do it in a good way. To do this, there is a policy of one country, two systems. In Hong Kong, the Chinese show that they can endure for a very long time, they can go very far to comply with this principle. Smashing protesting students on the pavement is worthless. But this will be the end of hopes for a peaceful reunion with Taiwan. So Xi Jinping will have a difficult discussion at the plenum. He will have to make a very important decision. Nevertheless, I am confident that we greatly exaggerate the significance of the Hong Kong crisis. Hong Kong is the joker. Does the Chinese leadership have a wing of hawks who advocate tough measures in Hong Kong? From whom can one expect harsh decisions? Army, state security. From whom can you expect soft options? These are economists who hope that the trade war with the United States will stop, there will be a truce. Let's not forget that the Chinese elites have a lot of pro-Western forces, because for the past 40 years the PRI has had a pro-Western policy. In China there are 3.5 million graduates of Western universities. Now they have a real breaking. Returning to the protests in Hong Kong, where do fair demands and legitimate concerns of citizens end, and where do political games and external interference begin? The main requirements of the protesters are practically fulfilled. The scandalous extradition bill is not just recalled, but officially thrown into the basket. Further, students put forward the following requirements: to deal with the police, who allegedly exceeded their authority, to drop charges from about 200 detainees. They also require direct elections of the local legislative assembly, which is now being appointed according to a rather complicated scheme, which certainly leaves the decision to Beijing. In the conditions of modern China, this is unrealistic. And this is understood by many in Hong Kong. In the local press, more and more often there are not just tips for students to calm down, because they are sawing the branch on which Hong Kong sits, there are already demands to use force, disperse, twist. The head of the Hong Kong administration, Carrie, introduced a new bill prohibiting the wearing of masks. And this means the resuscitation of English law of 1922. The fact is that in colonial Hong Kong unrest also occurred, and the demonstrators also covered their faces. Not the masks of Anonymous, of course, but ordinary cloth. And then it was forbidden. Now Carrie says, do you fly with the British flag? Do you want English law? Okay, you get it. The basis of the current demonstrations is discontent, the disappointment of the bulk of Hong Kong residents. When up to 2 million people came out for a demonstration, it would be strange to say that they were bribed by bad Americans. They were unhappy that they used to be chosen, top-class people, and around there was a sea of the Chinese poor, who tried to cross the border river from the mainland, agreeing to work for any money. And the Hong Kong people, who grew up in the hallways of English gentlemen, felt like compradors, intermediaries. They have good English, Western manners. They were butlers, store clerks, clerks in British banks. China rid in convulsions of the Cultural Revolution, and they in Hong Kong had quiet and smooth surface. But in recent years, everything has changed. The Chinese have become rich. Now people come from Guangzhou, from Beijing, from Shenzhen, who are much richer than Hong Kongers. They are buying real estate, and immediately the prices jumped up. Now it is difficult for the native to buy an apartment. Places in prestigious Hong Kong universities are occupied by children of the mainland elite. And on the other hand, from the neighboring regions, from the mainland are sackers, spitting and screaming in the streets. And tourists from mainland China behave differently from the Hong Kong people. And they speak another dialect. And tourists from mainland China behave differently from the Hong Kong people. And they speak another dialect. And tourists from mainland China behave differently from the Hong Kong people. And they speak another dialect. Do you know the movie Joker? So, Hong Kong for China now is the Joker, a man with deep complexes who decided to take revenge. And they take revenge for the fact that they are no longer admired. They do not promise gold parachutes and salaries with many zeros. In addition, Hong Kong youth have fewer social elevators. Therefore, the buzzing guys, and many of them are holders of special, semi-English passports, hope that they will be put on a steamer and taken out. After the events on Tiananmen, the organizers were taken to Taiwan, the USA, Canada, Europe. The feeling of lack of prospects has intensified now, right on the eve of opening up new perspectives. Last year, a new long-term project was published to create a new huge cluster from Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Macau, according to the type of Tokyo, Yokohama or New York Bay agglomerations. Gigantic funds had to flow there, new high-tech and high-paying places would appear. Great bet was placed on Hong Kong youth. Naturally, this takes several years. But if a person graduates from university this year and has nowhere to go, there is frustration. The housing issue is not being resolved. Housing is very expensive. And the girls in Hong Kong and throughout China do not get married if the groom does not have a separate living space. There is no work. What is left to do? Go buzzing. Color revolutions do not organize out of the blue. They always arise where there is an accumulated indignation of the people, and then technologists canalize it in the right direction. Here comes a peaceful demonstration, and suddenly, about 30 masked guys come off, with a Dubai, who are seizing the building of the Legislative Assembly that was empty on Sunday. They destroy all the equipment there, draw bad words on the arms of China and Hong Kong. And the local government is soft, and the local police too. As a result, the police became a beaten minority. They track down their children in schools, come to the addresses where they live. Agents of influence. It is surprising that, despite the riots, the police detain not so many participants. At our unauthorized rallies, people sweep. It happens several times more per day than in Hong Kong in a few months. What is the matter? Moreover, with the development of Chinese tracking technologies, they could arrest rebels for a sweet soul. Students primarily break surveillance cameras, wear masks. But the matter is not the softness of the police and the lack of security cameras. And in political will. No order from Carrie. And Xi Jinping, as it were, says to the Hong Kong authorities, you are a special administrative region, you have your own police, your own courts, which are judged by British laws, your own currency. So what about foreign intervention? It was, is and will be. In what forms was it? Naturally, leaving, the British left their agents, any country would have acted in their place. And direct agents of special services, and agents of influence, professors, journalists, businessmen, including millionaires. Now in China, by name, they called the Hong Kong Gang of Four, behind the protests. Hong Kong media moguls visited the United States. One of them is the head of Next digital concern Jimmy Lai, and Secretary of State Pompeo met with him. American NGOs and foundations were very active. The Chinese published data, from 1995 to 2015, the National Endowment for Democracy alone spent $4 million. Honestly, this is not much, right? But then for 2018, $6.5 million. This is money. But that's not the point. In America, Congress drafted the Hong Kong Democracy Act. This is practically a variant of the Magnitsky Law, according to which everyone who is involved in suppressing the protesters, in violating the principles of democracy, will be subject to sanctions. All organizations and companies cooperating with the authorities will be subject to sanctions. Americans are very interested in uncovering the Hong Kong situation. Why? The first and most obvious version, in order to slow down the movement of China to restrain it. But there is a second task. In the framework of the trade war, the US wants to eliminate the role of Hong Kong as a financial center. It is important for them to strike at Hong Kong, provoke Xi Jinping to sharp movements. So that Hong Kong becomes another wonderful Chinese city, along which, perhaps, double-decker buses will ride on the left side of the street. But so that it ceases to be a place of concentration of China's capital, necessary for the development of the economy and access to foreign markets. And Hong Kong newspapers write about this. Hong Kong is being transferred to American law to replace English law, the South China Morning Post wrote the other day. Thinking people understand that their future rests on a bitch who continues to be sold by the young visitors of the epoxy century.